I can't tell you how I know. Do with this information what you will. There's going to be a Nintendo Direct this month, and the one more thing, we'll have a teaser card with Andy. It'll be Advance Wars coming out next year. People are going to lose their minds. Okay, you got me. This is all a lie, and that's because this video is regrettably not about the surely inevitable but as yet unconfirmed triumphant return of Advance Wars, but rather is being made in response to YouTube superstar Woodhawker or Beat'em-Ups, also of the Nintendo podcast, who decided to liven up summer 2025 by conducting his very own social media experiment. In a Nintendo podcast, he alluded to knowledge of a Nintendo Direct with some juicy specifics, including a new Animal Crossing, and then tracked how the hype spread, apparently in direct proportion to his own sense of dread as he realised the monster he had unleashed. I only very obliquely mentioned that a rumour existed in the first few seconds of this video, but my channel very rarely addresses rumours directly anyway. Still, I'd wanted to talk about when and how Animal Crossing would come to Switch 2, and trend jumping is YouTube 101, so I brutally crushed the dreams of all those excited Animal Crossing fans in my audience a few weeks earlier by saying, probably not. However, inexplicably, not everybody watches Nintendo forecasts, so the buzz grew and grew. Wood soon regretted his decision, but I thought it would be interesting here to respond to Wood's original brief that he set himself, albeit with a video that doesn't involve manufacturing an Advance Wars League. Arguably, I already did this. Wood potentially might have saved himself some heartache by watching this video on rumours I did a year ago. In this, I talked about the optimism bias, I talked about herding effects, I talked about the emergence of people with seemingly accurate track records and how this can be a lot easier than you might think to develop in a crowded field due to sheer happenstance, and I talked about a lot more besides. Basically, he could have watched my video, broadcast it to his community to help my analytics, but one, it would have made less compelling YouTube, and two, it seems that he also, quite inexplicably, doesn't watch Nintendo Forecast. This critical personality flaw notwithstanding, this video is not intended to put the boot into Wood, whose work I've enjoyed for years and who seems to be a pretty good bloke with a killer instinct for how to make a splash on YouTube, and redemption arcs are good viewing anyway, so I'm sure he will survive. I should note that as I'm finishing the script for this, I note an interesting new episode of Nintendo Podcast featuring Wood's interview with psychologist Dr. Stephen Sloman, which is pretty interesting and worth checking out. The thing is, while the treatment of the issues that he raised may have been problematic in certain respects, his questions that inspired those issues were genuinely interesting, and I want to take them seriously. Let's zone in then on what Wood wanted to get out of all this and see if we can address the points that he raises without requiring an apology tour at the end. We're going to dig deep, define our terms a bit, explore some of the psychology he discusses, and try to come up with some definitive answers. I'm going to quote Wood first, and then we'll unpick what he's actually saying. So he says, "Gaming leaks ruin surprises, spoil moments that we love, and I've always been curious, how do fake leaks get so much traction? Like, how does something so clearly fake go viral? We live in a culture of constant Nintendo Direct rumors, manufactured excitement, and clickbait YouTube titles. So I had a thought. What if I leaked huge gaming news? If I followed the spread of that leak, tracked its momentum and the ripple effects, could I conduct an experiment to find a way to stop fake leaks once and for all?" End quote. Okay, so first of all, this is kind of hard to unpick because there's a lot going on here, and I'm going to go line by line. Gaming leaks ruin surprises, spoil moments that we love. I think this is totally true, and I am with him entirely. I, for one, am particularly anxious around the release of new games because I absolutely don't want to be spoiled on anything, and it even bothers me to be spoiled that there are things to be spoiled about. I'm a Nintendo fan, and Nintendo's literal aim is to surprise and delight. You can't surprise if someone blew the surprise early. I kinda wish Mouse Mode had been a surprise for the January 2025 trailer, and I think the response would have been very different and probably a lot more positive if that had been new to people, because it was genuinely a really interesting development for the new system. However, before the end of this sentence, things take an abrupt 180-degree turn. How do fake leaks get so much traction? Because here's the thing, fake leaks literally don't spoil anything, because they're fake. So I would argue this is a completely different issue, and then would doubles down on it with how does something so clearly fake go viral, which kind of sets the frame for the video, that we're talking about fake leaks. Then at the end of his intro, there's a third objective, which I would argue is completely different again: how to stop leaks or rumours going viral. So let's first deal with the problem of real gaming leaks. This is frustrating and largely inevitable, I would suggest. Once Switch 2 entered manufacturing, all the security in the world was unlikely to stop one of the thousands of people involved somewhere along the process flouting NDA and putting photographs online, and in the world we live in, it only takes one person for it to be everywhere. Nintendo has at times shown a pretty litigious approach to leaks, clamping down really hard, for example, on leaks from the Nintendo playtest game, but it's kind of easy to stamp out fans who really love Nintendo and just want to talk about a game, and even then it's not like most details of the game aren't available if you want to do a bit of digging. Considering the case of the factory leaks, it's far harder to stop the spread of information like this without acknowledging in effect that they're true, which is commercially sensitive information, and that has a whole mass of further problems in terms of Nintendo's position. I'm sure Nintendo's lawyers will live up to their ninjutsu-inspired reputation and probably were smashing through the skylights even back then, but it's a bit like shutting the stable door after the rogue samurai has bolted. Other leaks, of course, happen around Nintendo Directs. People like Nate the Hate will frequently give a tip of the hat when something is coming, and frankly, I'm sometimes quite glad. It's especially helpful as a content creator, but even before I made content, it would be frustrating to make plans for a particular day and then find out that a Nintendo Direct is landing right then. Nintendo Directs are crafted to provide surprises and shift energies at particular times, but it's very difficult to avoid a mass of spoilery push notifications and internet chatter if you're even a minute late to the party. To their credit, Nintendo has twice recently given us much longer than normal advance notice of forthcoming Directs in the form of the June 2024 and April 2025 Directs, both of which were exceedingly consequential. They have also given us Nintendo Today, which allows us a quick way to access Nintendo content, but I also understand that they like the element of surprise in terms of their announcement schedule. I'm sure if a mass of people asked Nate not to share what he knows, he'd probably keep stum, but someone else would step into his place. It's a challenge Nintendo must cope with, and frankly a challenge I'm rooting on them to solve. I know this may sound strange for a channel that is literally geared around forecasting Nintendo, but to me, it's no fun if we actually know what is happening. The challenge of this channel is to try to understand Nintendo, and forecasting the big moments is just the final boss of that particular objective. I think it's likely over time that they will get better, but it's always tricky because you just can't keep a circle of trust that small for that long without unduly hindering yourself. Surprises are important, but they're not the only thing important for a company that's in the top 10 list by market capitalization in a G7 nation. So how do we stop genuine leaks? As fans, the only thing we can really do is aggressively not cover leaks, but the problem is that the leaks are 10 a penny, so the only real solution would be to stop any ungrounded speculation about Nintendo titles at all. Now, even this channel, which is explicitly intended to bypass the rumour mill and use a more probabilistic approach to seeing into Nintendo's future, most of the time, doesn't completely bypass the rumour mill. It's quite rare that I'll address rumours directly, with the exception of that period in January where what I judged to be, and what indeed turned out to be, leaks were coming so thick and fast that I don't normally talk rumours but became almost a punchline for the channel, and it was more or less impossible to discuss things in the Nintendo sphere without facing that these leaks were revealing some pretty interesting ideas. The fact is, though, a healthy rumour mill is actually quite useful for stopping genuine leaks. When there's enough noise, it's impossible to detect a true signal. This is a clue to what makes some rumours fly while others flounder, but I'll get to that a bit later. For now, let's wrap up our detour to genuine leaks by saying basically that they are ugly facts of life. As individuals, Nintendo has empowered us. We can mute all Nintendo social media content and use Nintendo Today as the font of Nintendo wisdom, and probably we will still be surprised. But do we really want to live in a world without buzz and speculation and hype? I don't. from my days as a dedicated subscriber to Rich Ledbetter's Sega Saturn magazine to enjoying the Nintendo YouTube scene, including a lot of content such as Beat 'em Up, Switch Force, Nintendo Prime, Crossing Channel, and others that were mentioned in the original Wood video. Having a space for speculation is always something that appeals to me. But we need to accept that sometimes what is being speculated about is going to be wrong. So, that whittles us down to fake leaks, which is really the subject of Wood's experiment. Why do fake leaks happen? How do they spread? And how do we stop being suckered by them? I think the why do fake leaks happen angle probably deserves the least attention. There are so many different motives, from mischief to attention to boredom to delusion to running a 4-week social experiment on your audience. It's also worth mentioning here that Wood's conclusion, as expounded in a podcast with Nate from Nintendo Prime, was that language specificity is going to be important here. Rumours and leaks are quite different. I generally try, not sure if I always succeed, but I definitely try to be very cautious about the use of the word leak. But as we'll see, sometimes what ends up being, air quotes, a major leak starts out as anything but. So let's move swiftly on to how rumours and purported leaks spread, which is probably the area where Wood's video most closely matches his journalistic aspirations, as he can genuinely point to the ways that his fake content has been amplified in both fair and unfair ways. This is where his video has been in some quarters interpreted, an interpretation he has gone to pains to refute by the way, but interpreted as an attack on channels like Nintendo Prime and Switchforce, whose focus is news and who have kind of mastered the art of using leak to draw eyeballs and turn a profit. Sidebar, personally I have nothing but love for these channels. Switchforce was one of the first Nintendo YouTube channels I watched extensively back in the early days of the Switch. I have great nostalgic affection for the days of Zach, Jake and Gabe talking up a storm, and huge respect for the way Zach has consistently reinvented the channel and how he's consistently used his voice for positivity. I've also been following Nintendo Prime since at least 2019 when the Switch Lite rumours started, and Nate also seemed like a great gentleman who takes a lot of wild and wacky stuff and consolidates it in a pretty balanced manner, with his literal tinfoil hat sometimes coming out of the closet for the goofier stuff. Still, inevitably the bigger and more successful channels who frequently use the more emotive clickable term leak in titles and thumbnails were going to broadcast this stuff out first, and generally speaking, people like Nate from Nintendo Prime, with more of a reputation to uphold, would actually show the longer clips of the original content to demonstrate what's happening more authentically. But then we got the rumour becoming self-reinforcing, with more people either warping the original message or dispensing with the original messenger entirely. Wood's video covers this extensively, so I don't really need to, and to be honest, the concept is the source of the children's game Telephone, except with Wood transmogrified from spitballing podcast host hinting that he has a source to, in the words of Game Reactor, a credible insider speaking out, or as Vice would have it, a prominent leaker talking. What this demonstrates, if demonstrations were needed, is the poor level of source checking and the lack of specific, accurate language by some parts of the gaming press. The problem, of course, is that podcaster with no track record tips isn't nearly as compelling as prominent leaker says, and since these channels and most of YouTube and the rumour space is monetized, which take is going to play and pay better? In the cases of employees for these kinds of online websites, and for professional full-time YouTubers, it is literally their jobs and what puts food on their families' tables. Wood's supposition is that people believed what he said because they simply wanted it to be true. His explanation is rooted in the idea of confirmation bias, that people believe things that reinforce existing hopes and beliefs. And honestly, I don't think that applies here. Yes, it's true that people tend to latch onto information that supports their prior beliefs, but it's not like Wood was issuing some polarizing statement on politics or theology. He was saying that a company that makes games is going to make this type of game that they sometimes make at a particular time. I'd say there's only a 10% chance we go into the 2030s without an Animal Crossing game having come to Switch 2. It's not impossible, we went 11 years between console Mario Karts, but it seems unlikely. The point at hand is that this was not something that greatly activated prior beliefs or attitudes, because an Animal Crossing next year, while a mildly surprising outcome, is not so far outside the realms of plausibility. If the information was that Animal Crossing was being rebooted internally, a belief that only the most desperate of Tom Nook's debtors might cleave to, it's still likely that this information would have spread, even though it's much more strongly negative. A 2020 study by Martel, Pennycook and Rand demonstrated that heightened emotions led people to believe and spread fake content more, but not real content, and this makes sense. Our emotions have an evolutionary purpose, which is to catalyze action. Now, for the truly passionate fans, the very mention of Animal Crossing provided a surge of emotions, which made the news more memorable and more exciting. Wood refers also to the authority bias, and this, I think, is a more significant contributor to the way that this spread. Despite the fact that he made only very caveated mentions of what he thinks is likely to happen, the fact that he alluded to a source and that he has a track record of not lying to his audience drew people's attention. The thing is, even those people who don't know Wood could reasonably take a punt on the likelihood or not of his rumour being truthful. Wood is a person with no track record of leaking, but who is highly connected in the YouTube Nintendo community and who feasibly could receive information. The assumption, therefore, would be that Wood was being honest in his reporting, irrespective of whether or not the source itself was actually credible. I've sometimes been asked to assess the veracity of particular leakers, and I've refused because I don't find it a useful or interesting thing to do, since by definition there's so much we just can't know about their webs of sources. Nevertheless, under normal circumstances, I would have put the odds of Wood himself being honest that he had heard something and not making it up on the spot as pretty high. I mean, I assume he lies to his audience less than 10% of the time. However, the judgment here isn't just on Wood himself, but his source, and this is what seems to be suppressed in some of the reporting that followed. In the version of this where Wood had a legitimate leak, it is given outsized standing by being broadcast on a significant Nintendo podcast. In people's minds, these two things became conflated, but they never should have been. Even if people trust Wood's own judgment in assessing leaks and veracity, he could be wrong, and that's before we consider that he had doubts that he expressed in the video in the first place. Not a surprise since he was lying, but all the same. Also, Wood stands to benefit from big newsy discussion coming out of his podcast, and so if in doubt, he might be more likely to share something than not, even if it's possibly of dubious provenance. There's also a halo effect when it comes to authority. So, for example, there are certain things where I think my judgment is pretty well calibrated because I understand them in some detail. There are certain things, technological details, for example, where I definitely know and openly say that my judgment is not especially well calibrated, as I don't have as strong an understanding of these details. A professor in astrophysics might not be a better person to talk about Animal Crossing compared to an Animal Crossing YouTuber, but the halo effect of somebody's other good works can mislead. Even when people have areas of expertise, caution should be exerted. A couple of times recently I disagreed with takes by Kit and Krista, including on things that are tangential to their own fields of expertise, the marketing of Nintendo games. Again, I must emphasize I love Kit and Krista, have watched them for years, and I think they're absolute gold dust in this community. So how can I have the temerity to question what they're saying in this way? Partly, this probably just shows an incredible arrogance on my part, and of course, people can make their own judgments in the audience. But A, I don't believe in suppressing credible opinions simply because someone authoritative has spoken, because that's a surefire way to miss things. But B, inside perspectives may have their own blind spots as well. I've used the proverb before in this context that, to a hammer, every problem is a nail, and I do think that Kit and Krista, by dint of their own job role at Nintendo, are more likely to see as problematic things that may well still cause dismay in Redmond, that may well have made their life difficult when they were working at Nintendo, but which I don't necessarily think the head office at Nintendo would be all that bothered by. In fact, we know from their conversations that there were many times when they found Nintendo's choices baffling, even while they worked there. So the fact that, as outside commentators, Nintendo's decisions sometimes appear baffling isn't necessarily an indication that Nintendo themselves are baffled. Now, sometimes they provide glimpses of information about discussions they've had, which do make me calibrate my opinions. And of course, they themselves are going of long experience, so I take their opinions very seriously indeed. But at the end of the day, these are opinions. Kit, Krista, Nate the Hate would if he weren't fibbing. All these people can have opinions and they can know things, and while there may be a part in the Venn diagram where informed speculation can be true, I think it's healthier just to treat these things for what they are: people's judgments. Wood also refers to the illusory truth effect, which basically means that the more you hear something, the more credible it feels, simply by repetition. It's actually worse than that, because when people are shown that something is wrong, their natural instinct is very often to double down and believe something all the more. Wood seems to have been somewhat aware of this, as he claims he wanted to reveal the truth after July, so that if an Animal Crossing announcement did eventuate in a July Direct, nobody could say, "Aha, you are lying to protect your sources." There's actually a whole range of psychological effects tangential to this, though, that I think are worth bearing in mind. There's the anchoring effect, which is where people tend to frame their responses around a reference point or anchor, which allows less scrupulous people to affect people's thinking by affecting their own anchor. For example, one study, a group of people were asked whether Mahatma Gandhi died before 9, and in the second group, they were asked if he died after age 140. When they were then asked to guess his actual age of death, the people who were anchored with age 9 guessed that he died 17 years younger than those who were anchored with the number 140, even though both 9 and 140 were clearly implausible. My guess is that if you poll people at random prior to Wood's fake rumour and after, that people beforehand would be subtly more pessimistic about Animal Crossing arriving sooner rather than later, even if they knew Wood's comments were unfounded. But let's not also ignore the simple fact that it's something to discuss. YouTube is a hobby, but it's also monetized, and money comes from clicks, and clicks come from something people are interested in discussing, and which frankly has lots of aspects to discuss. It's been pointed out, I think by Zach on Switchforce, that the Animal Crossing community in particular is more casual focused in nature, and so is potentially more vulnerable to this kind of deception because they're broadly insulated from the craziness of much of Nintendo leak culture. But the fact is that people just like this stuff. I like reading about leaks and teasers and what's to come. It's why I run a channel forecasting Nintendo stuff, but calling things leaks adds a little extra frisson to it. At this point, I think it's worth considering another, air quotes, leaker, who is not in fact a leaker at all, but who has got himself into hot water in the Nintendo community recently. This is Rhys Riley, the gentleman behind Kiwi Talks, a fantastic interview podcast. After sharing his own personal speculation, this was picked up by some less scrupulous media outlets as insider information, and the poor guy has been doing damage control ever since. This is ironically another example of how what someone says can be twisted out of all recognition, and it's a particular difficulty for anyone who is tangential to the commentary scene. Despite multiple subsequent clarifications, the original rumour kind of ran like wildfire because frankly most people don't see the original source, just the headlines thereafter. And these opinions do matter. Wood is a big enough figure in the Nintendo YouTube space that it's credible that he might have been told something, and the same with Rhys from Kiwi Talks. In both instances, I think there's a certain naivety about how people with connections or just a significant platform will be viewed differently from someone randomly spouting off information. So look, how these things spread is psychologically interesting, but fundamentally predictable. Multiply public interest by financial incentive and times by the standing and platform size of the person spreading the news, and you'll probably have a good chance of judging the likely spread of something like this. So now we come to the really important part. How do we stop this? How can we make sure that people don't get suckered by leaks and rumours again? But here's the thing. Do we actually want this to happen? I mean, really though. Nobody likes to feel foolish, but for most people, the thought of there potentially being a new Animal Crossing, a new Advance Wars, or Star Fox Grand Prix is a nice daydream to pass the time. It's harmless flim-flam that people write off, and I think there is something in that. But also, I guess it shouldn't be for some egomaniac with a Reddit account to direct the daydreams of people across the world. Nintendo's movements and approaches are genuinely interesting enough without adding artificial elements of drama. After all, I'm as excited by rumours as anybody else, and besides, it's my YouTube channel, so the only real limit is my personal judgment. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. If there's something truly awesome, I'll rock up to talk about it. My output in January 2025 attests to that. But I reckon only about 10% of my videos owe anything to leaks and rumours, and that's including that huge run in January where the sheer number of leaks overwhelmed the internet entirely. And I did actually obliquely, for about 20 seconds, discuss Wood's rumour when he raised it. I already had planned a video about the coming of Animal Crossing to Switch 2, and I decided to trend jump. But my channel right from the start, as a forecasting channel, was kind of designed to bypass the noise of the rumour circuit for many of the reasons that Wood is exposing. I put percentage forecasts of my levels of certainty into 5 bands: 10%, 30%, 50%, 70%, and 90% likely. These are pretty divisive with some people. A lot of people really like them, but a few people absolutely hate that I use percentage predictions, largely I suspect because they don't really understand the point. If I say something feels like a 70% likelihood to happen, this isn't a mathematically determined statement, but is just a representation of my confidence in the moment. And of course, there are plenty of times when I am absolutely dead wrong and new information comes to light that makes me change my mind. In fact, if new evidence comes along, I will often change that confidence level in a future prediction. But the idea is that when I review, as I do roughly every year, I should be able to see that my 10% shouts average out to coming to pass around 10% of the time, my 30% shouts 30% of the time, and so on. This allows me to calibrate and see whether I'm actually roughly on track over the course of the year. In my last review of how accurate I was pretty close to the mark on average performance for all 5 categories, but in many respects, how near or far I was isn't the point. In fact, I've recently had a number of hits from a raw prediction standpoint. I was cool on a June Direct, which of course didn't happen, expected a July Partner Direct, which did happen, and so on. But because I couch these as 70% certainties, it may well drag my result up, so my 70% calls are now closer to 80% or 85% coming true. I don't know if that's the case because I haven't assessed them all together, but that's one potential risk with being too close to the money. The idea isn't just to try to call what happens and what doesn't, but to give a hopefully realistic setting of expectations as to what feels likely and what doesn't. That's not to say I necessarily know anything more than anybody else, except through the research that I've done, but it does mean that I'm at least trying to discuss a level of certainty, and my whole process kind of relies on me being wrong in the correct proportions as well as being right, and that is the point, given an opinion in percentages feels a more honest way to me to account for these kinds of things. It's great to call things. I won't deny I got a smile when the July Direct was a partner showcase, just because it's nicer to call things right than wrong, but ultimately these forecasts are largely to open a discussion. There are times I've felt a lot more certain about things than other people, and there have been times when I've looked back in hindsight and thought, what was I thinking? I really didn't have a good grasp as I thought of a particular issue, but that's fine. We're not tracking planet-destroying asteroids, we're chatting about Nintendo games. So that's all my personal approach, but I don't necessarily think that most people in the YouTube crowd want to go to the hassle of setting up a YouTube channel to research and forecast Nintendo. So, what I think we need are simple rules of thumb to help us wise up and get better at handling rumours. Sure, I could suggest just everyone does some deeper research. I'd certainly suggest watching my guide to assessing leaks and rumours, which still holds true today, I think. But if I had to come up with a few golden rules, I would turn to a couple of books which were hugely formative in the development of this channel and which are still relevant to this issue. One is Philip Tetlock's Super Forecasting, which looked at how people could improve their judgment on the likelihoods of future events coming to pass. Another is Julia Galef's The Scout Mindset, which she defines as the motivation to see things as they are, not as you wish they are. Sounds simple, but it is, of course, incredibly complex. But let's take all this and provide 5 golden rules that I think everybody from big content creators to happy-go-lucky fans of games with plumbers can follow to judge if a rumour is likely to be true. These are drawn from my reading and they may not be perfect, but I think they are a starting point. If you come across a rumour and want to assess how likely it is, here would be my approach. Rule 1. Remain calm. It's easy to be led into cartwheels of horror and glee because of internet news, but Animal Crossing not coming in 2026 just means that the team has more time to work on the next game and make it even more amazing. It's frustrating waiting, sure, but it'll all be worth it in the end. We know that emotionality affects people's judgments, so look at the statements analytically on their own merits. Rule 2. Unpack. If a rumour has multiple parts, then each should be judged on their own merits. Wood's rumour had a huge amount going on: a July Direct, particular games, the Animal Crossing reveal, even specifics of how and when it would happen. Wood's experiment was to show how something, in his words obviously fake, could spread, and I suggest that this laundry list would generally be laughed out of the room if it had appeared in most other places than from Wood's mouth on a podcast. But the key is to question now just how likely are these rumours to be true individually, but also how likely are they to be true collectively. Nothing's going to be 100%, even if Wood's rumour had been absolutely rock-solid truth. The tsunami warnings in Japan on the 31st of July could easily have nudged a direct off the July slot. Sometimes even Nintendo's plans are diverted by external events. And we've all seen laundry list rumours, and they are almost inevitably wrong. Now, as part of this, one component is worth considering particularly. Is the person sharing the rumour usually correct, and do they have a track record? I think there was a decent reason to think that Wood did have a source, not least the fact that he had said he had a source, and that most YouTubers don't actively lie to their audience. But then it was also a second-hand piece of information from someone with no track record of verifying this kind of thing. Even if Wood was credible generally, when you break it down, there are a lot of things that need to come right. It should be pointed out that by definition, Nintendo Directs are unlikely combinations. The odds of Rhythm Heaven and Tomodachi Life coming together in March were remote, and that's why these laundry lists hold fascination even when people know they're wrong. Still, when did you last see a laundry list issued weeks in advance that was substantially true? Someone may have an example, but I can't think of one, and that's why unpacking is an important second step. Rule 3. Measure your certainty. This doesn't need to be mathematical. Sure, I use 10%, 30%, 50%, 70%, and 90% bands because I actually track and check back to see how accurate I am. But simply saying this feels like a coin toss, or this feels extremely likely, or Snowmad's chance in Fire Mountain to me is useful as a way to judge whether or not something is actually likely to happen. Better still if you record your forecast, chuck it into your phone calendar for 6 months' time, because there's nothing better for correcting your judgment than the cold slap of being completely wrong. Trust me. But that's why personally I like to look at it as not magically being right all the time, but rather being right or wrong predictably enough that if you think something is 50-50, then it probably does have a half and half chance of coming true because you're attuned enough to what feels likely and to what doesn't. Being wrong a lot is inevitable. There is some evidence that many of the most respected commentators, irrespective of political persuasion, are actually the worst at this kind of thing because there is so much riding on being seen to be right, and so they will explain on news programs in careful detail why something won't happen one day and while it was always inevitable the next. We should also, of course, keep updating our measurements as new information comes out, although bearing in mind that if one piece of news is bouncing around the echo chamber, that in itself isn't a sign of something becoming more credible. Rule 4. Outside view first. This is from super forecasting guru Philip Tetlock. If I predict an Advance Wars game this year, first we should think, what is the outside odds of any kind of Advance Wars game this decade? Barring excellent reason, this should probably be a better anchor for likelihood than whatever my latest invented rumour may be. This is a way of getting past the illusory truth effect or other similar difficulties. Is an Animal Crossing game likely on Switch 2? Yes, there's good reason to think that there will be one. Are big games usually revealed at the end of Directs? Sure. Are general Directs usually in July? Dicier. Are Animal Crossing games usually out in the first 12 to 18 months of a new console? Of late, not really, but there's only really 2 examples of where this hasn't happened because Animal Crossing games are fairly infrequent. It can be very easy to get caught up in one piece of news or hype without stepping back and looking at the whole picture. Now, doing this isn't perfect. The status quo bias is also a thing, and we should remember that rules do get broken all the time. Still, often the further back you can step from a problem, the clearer it is to see all the big patterns at play. Rule 5. Reverse your biases. If you believe Animal Crossing is coming Imagine that it's 2028 and an Animal Crossing title has yet to even be announced. Now, figure out, why might this have happened? Airlines have developed impeccable safety standards, and one of the ways they do this is by anticipating errors by doing a pre-mortem. If a post-mortem is why something deadly occurred, a pre-mortem attempts to imagine what the post-mortem might be if things aren't fixed preemptively. By not just saying what could go wrong, but imagining that something has gone wrong and requiring people to dig deeply into why, more imaginative and worthwhile solutions are usually created. If every YouTuber who covered the wood rumour had given reasons for skepticism in equal measure, well, perhaps we might have had a more balanced discussion. So there we are. Remain calm, unpack the rumour, measure your certainty, outside view first, and reverse your biases. And through some crazy wacky happenstance, those 5 rules spell out the acronym rumour, in the American spelling at least. But what about more advanced cases? What if multiple credible sources start coming up with the same rumour? Surely then it starts to become more credible. You're going to want to check out this video on my channel for those trickier cases, and if you share this video, comment, like, subscribe, or even check out my Patreon, I would really appreciate it. If not though, I'm still so grateful you're here, and I look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.